The baby wasn't crying when she first placed him there. Wrapped in a soft, threadbare blanket, tucked in a basket lined with the only scarf her mother had ever given her, the child slept, his tiny chest rising and falling with soft innocence. But when she took one step back, just one, the child stirred. And then he cried. It was the kind of cry that punched the air, that grabbed God by the collar, that made the pigeons in the roof of the church flutter and fly. And still, she did not return. She stood by the gate, hands trembling, eyes swollen, waiting for someone, anyone, to open the church door and see him before the sun rose. When the door creaked open and the Reverend gasped, she turned her back
and ran.
22 years later, that cry still echoed in her head. It haunted her like a hymn stuck between the notes. She could still hear it on rainy nights, when the wind slapped her window and silence clawed at her gut. She had not told anyone. Not the man she married later. Not the daughter they raised. Not even the Lord she prayed to every Sunday. Some sins, she thought, stayed nailed to the soul. But the thing about sin is, it doesn't stay buried. Especially not when your past finds your address again. It started on a regular Wednesday. She was sweeping the front of her tailoring shop in ABA, humming to herself, when she noticed the flyer. It was stuck to the notice board across the road. Slightly torn. Faded. A face stared back at her. Young, sharp, with determined eyes and a gentle smile. Above it, bold black letters. Have you seen this man? Meet Pastor Ezekiel, a story of grace, abandonment, and miracles. And just beneath that, a line that made her world freeze. Abandoned at the door of Holy Grace Baptist Church, ABA, 22 years ago. Her broom fell from her hand. Her throat locked, because she knew that face. Not from memory, but from resemblance. Those cheekbones. That chin. He looked exactly like her brother, Nana, before he died in that bus crash. This was him. Her son. The baby she left.
Alive.
Speaking. Preaching. And looking for his past. She sat in the back row of the crusade, hidden beneath a wrapper and a borrowed wig. The tent was packed. Plastic chairs. Children sleeping on laps. Ushers wiping sweat from brows. Mosquitoes buzzing under the floodlights. But all she could see was him, standing on the platform, microphone in hand, moving with the confidence of someone who'd turned his pain into power. And they left me at the door of a church, he said, voice steady. No name. No note. Just a scarf, blue and gray, with the scent of something I later learned was camphor. Laughter scattered lightly through the crowd. But not from her. She felt like her lungs were tightening, like the chair beneath her was the only thing stopping her from crumbling into the sand. He continued, I always wondered, what kind of woman does that? Leaves a baby at God's door and walks away. People murmured. Someone clapped behind her. A few shouted, She stared down at her lap. This kind, she thought. The kind that was 17.
Scared.
Alone.
Disgraced.
And poor. The kind that had been raised by a father who beat the word into her, but beat the love out of her. His name was Ezekiel. She had never given him that name. But it was the one the Reverend had chosen the morning he found him wrapped at the door. Ezekiel, God strengthens. She used to whisper another name when she nursed him under the bridge. Nehemiah. My father has done well. Back then, she thought it was irony. Now she knew it was a prayer that took 22 years to answer. After the crusade, she lingered behind the tent as people swarmed him for photos, healing, testimonies. He smiled at them all, kindly, patiently. She wanted to go to him, to touch his face, to say I'm sorry, but the words dried at her lips. So she turned and walked home, and cried until her daughter, Ada, knocked on her door and asked, Mummy, are you okay? She nodded, but no, she wasn't, because now she had a face to the ache, a voice to the past, a man who once fit into the crook of her arm, now standing in front of thousands, talking about grace. Her son, Ezekiel. The next morning, she returned to the church. Holy Grace Baptist.
It had changed.
The compound was bigger, the walls painted a dull white. The gate rusted but sturdy. But the step, that very step where she had laid her baby, was still there. She knelt beside it.
And wept.
The reverend who had found him was long dead. But an old cleaner remembered. Yes, the man said, sweeping leaves. I remember the baby. Reverend Paul raised him until the missionaries came and took him abroad. He was a quiet child. Didn't speak until he was 3. But when he finally did, he said, God is here.
She broke again.
Because that's what she used to whisper to him as a baby, rocking him beside the open gutter under the bridge. Chinik di Ibia. God is here. She didn't think he'd remembered, but God had. She began attending his crusades.
Quietly. Disguised.
From the shadows. And in each sermon, she heard pieces of herself. Bits of the pain she'd wrapped in silence. Fragments of the boy she'd thought lost to time. He told stories of loneliness. Of growing up with questions no one could answer. Of being told, your mother did what was best for you. But how could he know that? How could they know? He didn't know her story. Didn't know about the night his father ran and left her bleeding. Didn't know how she had tried to raise him in an abandoned building with rats and attics. Didn't know how the women in the market called her a Shawo girl when she begged for food with him tied to her back. She wanted to tell him. But how do you walk up to a grown man, one who has built a life, a faith, a following, and say, I am the woman you've spent your whole life preaching about? One evening, she visited his website. There was a contact form. A prayer request box. She typed, Dear Pastor Ezekiel, I know this will sound strange, but I know who left you at that church. I know why. And I think it's time you knew too. Please, if you are willing, let me tell you. She didn't leave her name. Just a phone number. An old one. One she barely used anymore. Then she shut her laptop and sat in silence for hours. The next morning her phone rang. Hello, she whispered. The voice was calm.
Deep. Clear.
Good morning. This is Ezekiel. I saw your message. She could barely breathe. He continued slowly. Can I ask, are you the one who left me there? Her lips trembled. Then she said, Yes, I am. Silence followed. So deep she could hear her heartbeat. Then he asked, Why now? She swallowed hard. Because I've been dying for 22 years, and I want to live before I go. The cafe was small, tucked between a pharmacy and a shuttered bookstore. A quiet place with cracked tiles, mismatched chairs, and a single ceiling fan that clicked as it spun. It was her idea to meet there. Neutral. Away from the church. Away from the noise of crusades and curious eyes. She wore her simplest clothes. No makeup. A head tie that covered the gray strands sneaking from her scalp. Her hands shook, so she clasped them under the table. Then he walked in.
Tall. Calm.
No entourage. No camera crew. Just a young man in a blue shirt and sandals, carrying a quiet storm in his eyes. He paused when he saw her. She stood slowly, unsure whether to smile, cry, or drop to her knees. He looked at her for a long time. A full minute. Studying her face like it held the answer to a riddle he'd been asking since he could form sentences. Then he said the one thing she hadn't prepared for. You look like me. Her lips parted. Nothing came out. He sat across from her, leaned forward slightly, his eyes softer now, but filled with 100 unspoken things, questions, rage, disbelief, maybe hope. She managed a whisper. Your name was Niameka. I called you that for the few months I had you. He said nothing, just stared at her with that quiet intensity. She continued. I was 17. My father had thrown me out after I got pregnant. The man responsible vanished. I tried to keep you alive under the bridge behind Ariaria Market. But you fell sick, and I had no money. No help. She paused, breath catching. The night I left you, I wanted to die. He looked away. You didn't think of coming back for me? I did. Her voice cracked. I came back the next day. But you were gone. The church gate was locked. I waited for hours. And then, I convinced myself you'd be better without me. He nodded slowly. Everyone told me that. Your mother loved you enough to let you go. That line haunted me. Her eyes welled up. I didn't feel like I was loving you. It felt like murder. He looked at her again.
Harder now. I needed you, he said.
Growing up, I needed you more than I needed God. Tears slid down her cheeks. She didn't wipe them. I know, she whispered. I needed you too. They sat in silence, letting the weight of 2 decades rest between them. Then he reached into his wallet and pulled out something. A piece of cloth. Faded. Blue and gray.
Threadbare.
I kept this, he said. The Reverend said you wrapped me in it. Her hands flew to her mouth. That was my mother's scarf. It was all I had left of her. He nodded. I used to hold it when I cried. Even in boarding school, university. I kept it. He slid it across the table. She touched it.
Trembling.
Then looked up. I never stopped thinking about you. Every day. Every time I heard a baby cry in church. Every time someone said abandoned child on TV. It was like a knife. But I didn't know how to fix it. He stared at her again, searching. Are you here to fix it? She hesitated. I'm here to try. They met again the following week. This time at his apartment. No cameras. No script. Just a mother and the son she lost, trying to piece together what time had scattered. She learned he had been adopted by missionaries when he was 4. Taken to Jos schooled in the north. Returned to ABA when he turned 21 to start his ministry. He learned she had married at 26. Lost 2 pregnancies. Raised a daughter who now studied pharmacy at UNN. And that every year on the 15th of April, the day she left him, she fasted and prayed for his soul. You never married again? He asked one evening, sipping tea. She laughed lightly.
No.
I didn't think I had the right to be happy after what I did. He looked at her then, really looked, and said, You've punished yourself enough. They walked together sometimes.
Through the markets.
Along the church street. And people began to whisper. The resemblance was too strong. A week later, Ezekiel stood on his pulpit and broke the silence. He told the story, all of it, about the scarf, the door, the fear, the forgiveness. And when he called her up to the altar and said, This is my mother, the entire church rose in stunned silence. Then applause, and tears, and more stories. Because that day, more than 6 people in that congregation admitted that they too had children somewhere or had been abandoned themselves. And healing spread like fire. That night, she held her son's hand and asked the question she'd buried for 22 years. Do you forgive me? He looked at her, eyes full of something she hadn't seen since the day she left him on that step. Yes, he said. Because without your decision, I wouldn't be who I am. And maybe, just maybe, God was standing at that door too. The week after Ezekiel introduced her to the world, something changed in the air. Not just for them, but for the town. People started coming forward, with their own secrets, their own losses, their own abandoned scarves. The church had to open its doors on weekdays because the pews filled even when no service was scheduled. Some came to pray. Some came to confess. Some just came to sit and cry, like she once did under the fig tree behind the church, 22 years ago, wondering if the baby in her belly would forgive her for the life she could not give. Now she stood beside him on the altar, not as a ghost from his past, but as a living story of restoration. Ezekiel called it the revival of the forgotten. But in private, they called it something else, the ministry of scarves, because every story seemed to have one. An elderly man came forward one evening after service. He brought an old plastic bag wrapped in tape. Inside it was a baby's bonnet and a photo, water-damaged, curled at the edges.
My daughter, he said.
I gave her up at birth. Her mother had died. I wasn't ready. I haven't seen her since 1988. He was crying. Not from sadness, but from hope. Then there was the teenage girl who left her baby with an aunt, who later disappeared. And the woman who confessed she'd hidden the truth of her birth from her child out of shame. Ezekiel listened to them all. And when they finished, he'd place his hand gently on theirs and say, You're not alone. It was the thing he once craved. Now he gave it freely. For her, the healing didn't come all at once. Some days, she still woke up expecting to feel that old emptiness in her chest. But now it was replaced by moments, strange, quiet, beautiful ones. Like the time Ezekiel invited her to his office and handed her an envelope. Inside, a certificate for a sewing machine, fabric rolls, and rent for a new shop. For you, he said. You gave me life. Let me give yours a fresh start. She didn't cry, not immediately. But when she got home, she knelt beside the bundle and wept like she did the night she left him. Only this time, the tears tasted different. Less salt, more grace. Ezekiel invited her to travel with him. First to Enugu, then Port Harcourt, then Abuja.
Not to speak, just to sit beside him.
People always stared. Whispers followed. But when they heard the story, when they saw the gentle bond between them, many wept. Others came forward with stories they'd hidden for decades. Some even said, "Your mother's courage gave me the strength to face mine." And that, perhaps, was the strangest miracle of all. That the very thing she'd thought would damn her forever had become the thing healing others. One night in Owerri, as they sat in a hotel lounge after service, Ezekiel asked a quiet question. "Mama, did you ever think of ending your life?" She didn't answer at first. She stirred her tea. Then she said, "Yes, twice." He nodded. "Me too. Once in boarding school, another in university." She looked up sharply. He met her eyes. "I used to think I was a mistake, a thing someone threw away. I'd cry in the hostel at night and wonder what I did to deserve that pain." Her throat tightened. But, he continued, "I also believe that pain taught me to listen, to see people." He smiled gently. "To find you." They didn't speak after that for a while. Just sat. Two people with scars that matched, like pieces of cloth stitched back together. The next day, at a youth gathering, Ezekiel preached from Luke 15, the parable of the prodigal son. But this time, he twisted the ending. What if the son didn't return, he asked. What if it was the mother who came back, afraid, ashamed, but still holding hope? The hall was silent. Then he said, "Sometimes, love means leaving the door open, even when you're not sure anyone's coming." He gestured to her in the crowd. "She left me at a church door. And 22 years later, she came back."
People wept.
And for the first time, so did he. She met a woman after that service.
Young.
Nervous. "I'm pregnant," the girl whispered. "And I was going to leave the baby at that same church until I heard your story." She placed something in her hand, a small scarf, soft and pink. "I want you to have this," she said, "as a reminder that your story saved someone else's." She clutched it to her chest. And suddenly, the scarf that once symbolized shame now held something new. Legacy. Rain poured the morning the church hosted its largest gathering in years. Not for a crusade, not for healing, not for deliverance, but for a service titled Grace at the Door. It was Ezekiel's idea to bring together everyone whose life had been touched by the story. A reunion of the lost and found. A celebration of the ones who had been left behind and those who dared to return. The banner outside read, "One child, one scarf, one second chance." Inside the church, the air was thick with something more powerful than incense, testimony. Mothers clutched children they once thought they'd lost. Fathers stood beside sons who once bore different surnames. Old friends reunited. Some strangers simply hugged each other and wept. And near the front, she sat. The woman who had once left her baby at a church door, now seated where she once fell to her knees in grief. But this time, she held her head high. Next to her sat Ezekiel. The baby she once feared would hate her forever. Now the man who called her mama in front of thousands. When Ezekiel stepped up to the podium, he carried something with him. It wasn't a Bible. It was the blue and gray scarf. Threadbare. Faded. Holy in its own way. "This," he said, raising it carefully, "was what my mother left with me. She thought it was all she had." He paused. But she left me more than fabric. She left me her fight, her strength, her name. His voice grew firmer. Some of you were left behind. Others left someone behind. And you've been carrying shame like it's your inheritance. He walked slowly down the steps of the altar. But I'm here to tell you today, grace waits at the door. Forgiveness knocks. And love keeps the door open. A cry burst from the back of the church. Someone dropped to their knees. And it began. One by one, people came forward bringing scarves, letters, photographs, offering the things they'd carried in silence. It was not an altar call. It was a homecoming. After the service, someone found her at the back of the church, folding programs into neat stacks. A young woman, no more than 23. She stood awkwardly, fingers fumbling with her purse. Then she whispered, "Ma, I'm sorry to bother you, but I've never met anyone who's walked through what I'm walking through now." The woman smiled softly. "You're not bothering me, my dear." The girl bit her lip. "I had a baby last year. Gave him up. I haven't forgiven myself." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope. Inside, a photo of a baby in a hospital crib and a white ribbon with his name, Chimdi. "I want to believe God can still use me, but it's hard." The older woman took her hand. "My son taught me something," she said. "The past doesn't disqualify you. It prepares you." She squeezed gently. "You're not finished. You're just beginning." Later that night, as the rain softened and the streets emptied, Ezekiel and his mother sat outside the church. The same steps where her story began. She touched the scarred concrete beside her. "I used to think this place was cursed," she whispered. "That God judged me here." Ezekiel smiled. "But look what he did instead." She nodded, then looked up at the sky, where the stars had begun to pierce through the clouds. "Do you know what I think now?" she asked.
What?
"I think grace is good memory. It always comes back to where you left it." The next morning, she opened her new tailor shop, Scarves of Hope. People came, some to sew, some to share, some just to sit. Each scarf sold carried a note with it. "You are not forgotten. You are not alone. You are not your shame." And in the back corner of the shop hung the original, the faded blue and gray scarf, framed in glass, with a brass tag underneath. She left him at the door. Grace brought them both home. What would you do if you were in Ezekiel's shoes? Would you forgive your mother after 22 years? Do you believe every abandoned child deserves a second chance at life? Have you ever experienced rejection that turned into a blessing later in life? Do you think it's possible to truly heal from childhood abandonment? Why or why not? Thought Balloon, what lessons did this story teach you about forgiveness, destiny, and purpose? If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real-life inspired stories that uplift and transform lives. Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice might inspire someone else today. Tag someone who needs to hear this message of hope and forgiveness. Let them know it's never too late for grace.